Welcome to session 2 of this learning series, organized by the Global Council for Science and the Environment and the Land Peace Foundation. My name is Laura Weiland, and I'm part of the team at GCSE. And it's absolutely wonderful to see the high level of interest and number of people engaged in this work. We've had several hundred more registrations since the first session a month ago, and it's been really wonderful to just read through your reflection forms. So many of you already know GCSE, whether you're part of the membership community or joined us during the annual conference in January, or for the session 1 of this series. And for those of you who found us in other ways, I'm going to give just a little bit of context about GCSE, and Sherri will say a few words about the Land Peace Foundation. GCSE, the work that GCSE does spans boundaries between science and decision making in order to strengthen the impact of durable solutions to environmental challenges. The organization specializes in programs that foster collaboration between the diverse institutions and the individuals creating and using environmental knowledge across all sectors. The work that GCSE does is aimed at building scientist capacity, connecting with decision makers, fostering collaboration, and preparing future leaders. And at the 2021 GCSE conference, we began a discussion exploring questions related to ways of knowing, and among other things, how deeper understanding and collaboration between Indigenous science and ways of knowing and Western approaches to knowledge and learning, when valued together, could lead to better informed policy and decision making. In session 1, we looked at important historical contexts and the effects still very much present today. If you didn't have a chance to join us for the first session, that recording is available, and we definitely recommend that you take some time after this to watch it. So I have a few logistical reminders as we get started today. Please feel free to submit your comments and reflections through the chat for presenters, but what would be most helpful is if you put your questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll collate that. So in the second part of the session today, we'll pose as many of your questions and comments as possible to the presenters for discussion, and they may be able to answer also some of them through the Q&A function directly. We also will post a reflections form in the chat. We do encourage you to fill that out after each session with your thoughts and ideas or questions. You can choose one thing from the form that's most relevant to you, or however you want to put some thoughts down. It's really helpful to hear from you and to learn more about your work. This is also going to inform what happens next after this spring learning series. And lastly, I wanted to say that we are just really, really happy to be partnering with the Land Peace Foundation to bring you this series. And I wanted to introduce you to the Land Peace Foundation founding director, Sherri Mitchell, who is a citizen of the Penobscot Nation. And Sherri is an attorney who has worked in the US Department of Interior, associate at a law firm, civil rights educator for the Maine Attorney General's office, and a staff attorney at the Native American unit of the Pine Tree Legal. She's also a powerful teacher, author, researcher, and presenter who has over 3 decades actively involved with Indigenous rights and environmental justice work. Sherri has received numerous awards for humanitarian and international human rights work. And in 2016, her portrait was added to the esteemed portrait series of Americans Who Tell the Truth. And I wanted to highlight that because I feel like that recognition is actually, one of the things that I love the most about Sherri, her ability to deeply see and understand things and speak the truth about them in an important and often very eloquent and insightful way, even when it's hard. So thank you, Sherri, for all that you do, and I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Laura. I am very honored to be able to be joining you today as co-host for this program and also co-facilitator with my colleague, Dr. Darren Ranco. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Land Peace Foundation. Before we begin, the Land Peace Foundation is an organization that was founded in 2011. It focused on the preservation of Indigenous land, water, and spiritual rights, and the preservation of the Indigenous way of life. Our programs, our organization has 4 primary areas of programming. We do a lot of educational programming, including having an Indigenous leadership program called the Wabanaki Leadership Institute that is housed at the Wabanaki Center at the University of Maine, which is an intergenerational leadership program with representatives from all of the Wabanaki nations so Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq, and Maliseet. And we also have a law and policy focus area within our program in a land-based learning center at Wajukum Tiltina Kinship Community, which is an intentional eco-community located within Penobscot territory. And I have had the incredible honor over the years of doing an intense amount of work on some of these issues with my colleague, Dr. Darren Ranco. And I want to introduce Darren, who will be co-facilitating the session with me to you. And as Laura had kind of indicated when she introduced me, there's so much more to people than is present within their bios. And so a brief bio for Dr. Ranco is he's a citizen of the Penobscot Nation. He's the chair of Native programs at the University of Maine, as well as coordinator of Native Research. He's also faculty, maybe the chair of Department of Anthropology. He has a master's of studies in environmental law from Vermont Law School and a PhD in social anthropology from Harvard University. And he was an undergraduate Mellon Fellow from Dartmouth College. His research focuses on the ways in which Indigenous communities in the United States resist environmental destruction by using Indigenous diplomacies and critiques of liberalism to protect cultural resources, and how state knowledge systems rooted in colonial contexts continue to expose Indigenous peoples to an inordinate amount of environmental risk. He teaches classes on Indigenous intellectual property rights, research ethics, environmental justice, and tribal governance. And so he's been a natural partner for me through the Land Peace Foundation in the environmental justice and climate change work that the Land Peace Foundation does, but also in the education of students through the Wabanaki Leadership Institute. And one of the things that I will say about Dr. Ranco is that he's just incredibly generous with his time and his knowledge, and his ability to be able to bring the best out in his students is something that I really admire. So I would like to welcome Dr. Darren Ranco.
Thank you so much, Sherri. I really appreciate it. It's been a great honor to curate this series with you, Sherri, and GCSE. And, you know, it's where we've been. Laura already mentioned, you know, these three phases that were in session 2. You know, bringing that to, you know, we talked about history and the ongoing legacies of the colonial structures on Indigenous people and environments, and the practice of Western and Indigenous science and its influence over our environments as Indigenous people. Today, focusing in on the kinds of knowledge systems and relations that are embedded in Indigenous knowledge systems. But, you know, these two are sort of interlinked, and I'm sure you'll get the sense of that from our speaker today. And then the third session in a couple of weeks, really exploring the kinds of relationships around science and research that can happen through in Indigenous-led partnerships with Linda Tuhai Smith will be extraordinary as well. So I'll get right to this, introducing Kyle Whyte. And I'm lucky to call Kyle a friend. And, you know, in curating this, Sherri and I were like, who are the best Indigenous thinkers in these areas? The fact that we actually were like, these are our top choices, and we got our top choices, says a lot about the kind of people who care about these issues. So I'll introduce Kyle and hand it over to him. Kyle Powys Whyte is the George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, teaching in the environmental justice specialization. And believe it or not, I'm gonna do just a few of the things that he does. And I don't know of anyone who works harder than Kyle. Kyle currently serves on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the Management Committee of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, and the Board of Directors of the Pesticide Action Network of North America. He has served as an author for the U.S. Climate Change Research Program, including authorship on the 4th National Climate Assessment. He has received the Community Engagement Scholarship Award and Distinguished Partnership Award for Community Engaged Research from Michigan State University, the Bunyan Bryan Award for Academic Excellence from Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice, and the 40 Under 40 Alumni Award, and Dan Ide Distinguished Alumni Award from Stony Brook University. Kyle's involved with a number of organizations that advance Indigenous research and educational methodologies, including the Climate and Traditional Knowledges Work Group, the Sustainable Development Institute of the College of Menominee Nation, the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, and New Zealand's Maori Center for Research Excellence. He's a certificate holder of the training program to enhance the conflict prevention and peacemaking capacities of Indigenous peoples representatives from the United Nations Institute of Training and Research. He is the author of dozens and dozens of articles, many of which are core pieces in the thinking around Indigenous knowledge systems and their engagement with environments worldwide. And it's really just a distinct honor and pleasure to introduce him to you all this afternoon. So I'll hand it over to Kyle.
Thank you, Miigwech. Bonjour, everybody. I'm Kyle, and I wanted to thank Darren and Sherri for the invitation, and to the GCSE for the hosting. It's good to be in the position to have this conversation, and really appreciate the opportunity to share. So I wanted to provide some reflections related to my work on knowledge systems and relationships, sort of in a fairly high altitude way. And first wanted to start off by just talking a little bit about the context of the work that I do that is connected to supporting Native folks in our advancement in scientific fields as scientists, as people who engage in our knowledge systems in our own ways and the ways that our ancestors would have prescribed for us today. And then I'd like to move in and talking about, a particular angle of understanding how we can understand knowledge systems in terms of relationships. And I want to share some of the literature out there and some references I have for work that you can follow up on that speaks to some of the topics and the concepts and the situations that I'll be describing. And I'll try to end with some comments about collaboration across different knowledge systems. And I know that that's going to be a major topic in the final presentation of this series. So in terms of the work that I do, I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and we're part of the larger Anishinaabe group, and my tribe is located in Oklahoma, but Anishinaabe people are from the Great Lakes region. So there's many Anishinaabe nations, and I work at the University of Michigan. And so, I work right in our home territory, and with a number of other, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi people that also share this region as their homeland, and exercise stewardship over the lands, the environment in the Great Lakes region. So a huge part of my work has been the protection of the plants and animals, the habitats, the ecosystems that matter most to Anishinaabe people. So for example, one area of my work has been the protection of wild rice or monomen in the Anishinaabe language. I've worked for over 10 years with the College of Menominee Nation. They developed a Sustainable Development Institute for Indigenous people, for Indigenous research on sustainability. And I've been involved in numerous educational and scientific and training programs with them. And they really seek to try to center, the tribal college, as a key coordinating figure and institution within the overall scene in the Great Lakes for preparing for climate change. And so I really value that movement, right? That, back in the day, we had our own educational and research institutions, and over the years, they've been greatly suppressed. And so we're really trying to awaken them and to, again, play that important role in leadership, in science that matters to our communities. And obviously climate change is one of those huge topics that's scientific, and it matters to us. I'm one of the founding members and currently board chair of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. We bring together well over 30 different organizations that work on environmental justice in the state, organizations that work on behalf of people of color, of Native people, and we really mobilize to try to protect our communities from some of the worst environmental hazards that you can imagine. We both work with scientists, but also call into question scientific work that serves purposes that are detrimental to the health of many of our communities in Michigan. I'm a professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability, and a key part of my role is that we have one of the oldest environmental justice programs in an American university. And it's an amazing program where we focus on issues of science and equity and grassroots empowerment. In terms of policy, I've had a long relationship with the climate change program at the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. We do training for tribal staff on climate change planning. We've written numerous policies and reports on climate change policy as it affects tribes and Indigenous people. And as Darren mentioned, I'm currently serving on a new White House Advisory Council on environmental justice. And one of the key parts that we're working on is what's called the Justice 40 Initiative, which is that 40% of the federal investments in certain types of infrastructure like renewable energy, 40% of that needs to benefit communities that are affected by environmental justice. And we're also doing an upgrade and reform of Executive Order 12898 from 1994, which is the Environmental Justice Executive Order. I served on the Federal Advisory Committee on Climate Natural Resource Science in the Department of Interior. And we advised on a lot of different projects within Interior, especially some of the programs seeking to promote actionable science on climate change, like the Climate Adaptation Science Centers. And that Federal Advisory Committee, when I served on it, had several other folks that were Native or who represented Indian country. And so we worked together on a number of documents and reports tied to empowering tribes to be able to work with federal agencies on climate change planning, using actionable science. And the advancement and empowerment of traditional knowledge, of Indigenous knowledge, was a huge part of that work. I've been an author on the National Climate Assessment. The National Climate Assessment, which is a synthesis of information on climate change risks and so on that affect the United States, going back several reports, we have a chapter that's just devoted to tribes and Indigenous people. But actually, it's important to note that, back in the 1990s, the National Climate Assessment worked to sponsor a conference on Indigenous people and climate science that had many Native knowledge keepers and tribal leaders and others. And actually the 2001, the first National Climate Assessment, had a chapter in its foundational report that was devoted to tribes and Indigenous people. And so there's a long legacy of Native people being involved in the National Climate Assessment. I do work within some important networks that seek to support especially Native students and Native persons within scientific fields. The Rising Voices Center is operated through the National Center for Atmospheric Research. It has an annual conference that brings together non-Native scientists and Native knowledge keepers and Native students and others from the Native community to try to figure out how we can work together to address climate change. And so it's a pretty big network now, and Rising Voices does other events as well besides that conference. I'm a big promoter of the importance of Indigenous research, and that kind of goes back to something I mentioned earlier, that back in the day we didn't have to wonder about whether we were marginalized within knowledge fields or science fields, because we had our own knowledge institutions, and they were able to play the roles that they were intended to play in our society, whether that's the protection of our health or the assurance of good quality foods. But now if you look at the major kind of knowledge institutions that everybody knows about, like universities or certain government agencies, they're not ones that are run by Indigenous people or even have that many Native folks that 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 are in them, right? We faced barriers. And so I think the movement to awaken, to build, to empower our own research institutions using our own methods is a critical one. And so I've served on the external advisory board for Napayote Maramatonga, which is the largest Indigenous research group in the world. It focuses on Maori research, and the speaker in the next presentation, Linda Smith, has been instrumental in the formation and leadership of NAPI. And lastly, I serve on different boards, and one is the Pesticide Action Network, which while it's focused broadly on communities affected by pollution, there's important commitment in Pesticide Action Network to grassroots science, to community-based science, and to the support of Indigenous people facing pollution issues tied to farming and agriculture. So that's a little bit about the kind of the background context that I work in. And for me, it's very important that in the work I do, I'm guided by the priorities that Native folks set, that tribes set, that Indigenous people set for our communities. And so, for me, being Anishinaabe, being Potawatomi, I see the work that I'm doing as focused on the things that matter to us, our political sovereignty, our way of life, our support networks, our just our community, right? And making sure that our community is there to be supportive of the things that individual Anishinaabe persons need to live good lives and to be okay, and to feel that they can both live in the ways that they want to live, that are right for them. They can pursue the careers they want to pursue, but also when things aren't right, that they can stand up politically and do something about it, and that we'll all be there for each other to support that taking of action for the sake of restitution and justice. So a huge part of what I do, is actually facilitate conversations across folks that are part of kind of different knowledge systems, and I know for this conversation, others, we sometimes use, Western science and Indigenous science, and there's lots of ways to differentiate, and I'm not going to necessarily subscribe to one of them here. but what I did want to say is that, multicultural knowledge exchange is, a huge part of my work. And so I want to talk about some of the things I've sort of learned along the way about the topic of the presentation. So, first of all, what I wanted to say is that, any knowledge system, its purpose, is to provide reliable information of different kinds, for the people that knowledge system is accountable to. But knowledge systems also do more than that, right? I mean, knowledge systems are part of our identity. They're part of who we are. They're part of our culture. They're part of our aspirations and goals, what makes things meaningful for us. So any knowledge system has relationships in it. And obviously I work both within the context of Anishinaabe science and knowledge, but I'm also at a research university. I've worked at other research universities before, and so I definitely have experience in some of the different knowledge systems. And I find that, like, say in my current university position, that definitely people that work on like environmental systems understand relationships involved in their knowledge system. But when we talk about knowledge systems and relationships, we're talking about the whole thing. Right? The institutions, the peer review processes, the ceremonies. I just attended our graduation at the University of Michigan. The way that we rank and understand success, the standards of collegiality, the standards of what it means to advance, mentorship, mentee relations, teachers and students, ethical norms and codes. All of these are the relationships that go into a knowledge system and are part of a knowledge system. And I think one of the important insights, at least I've found that's come from Indigenous knowledge systems today, right now, is that we've really embraced the idea that a knowledge system needs to be understood in terms of all of the relationships that go into it. So for us as Native folks, we've been really appalled by what's come out about some of the abuses that students face within universities, or some of the the burdens and harassment that, you know, junior professors face or junior scientists face in departments or laboratories, right? Because for us, that's not a good knowledge system, right? You can't, you know, somehow separate the empirical science from the overall atmosphere and context. They're all relationships that go into that knowledge system, and a knowledge system that, you know, is not equitable in different ways, that's violent in different ways, you know, is one that really at that point shouldn't be counted as a proper institution for delivering knowledge, right? And so for us, it's very important to take that holistic sense. You know, people need to be safe. They need to experience equity. They need to experience empowerment, confidence, and encouragement within the knowledge systems that matter to them. And so this is important because, you know, all of us, depending on which knowledge systems we're part of, you know, it could be a university science, it could be a Anishinaabe Lodge, it could be anything, right? You know, we're going to have different understandings. And, you know, sometimes when you're involved in more than one knowledge system, it does kind of give you some insights that others might not have about that knowledge system. I think Native folks like myself who, you know, work in universities, and we're looking at, you know, at these institutions from that perspective and from that standpoint. And so I think a lot of our observations are absolutely critical in terms of thinking about what relationships are really at play and what really matter within a knowledge system. And so, yeah, absolutely, relationships can serve different purposes and priorities within knowledge systems. You know, one thing that you know, a lot of Native people have noted about certain universities is that oftentimes the research is not one that the outcomes of that research really have anything to do with the sorts of things that tribes want. And I'll be talking a little bit about that later. You know, oftentimes, like in my, you know, current job, when I review or evaluate for different departments, you know, at various universities, you know, folks will talk about the purpose of, you know, publishing like only to get tenure, right? You know, so there's purposes for, you know, all sorts of different knowledge, but I think that's an important space where we can actually talk about, you know, what it would mean for science to empower Indigenous people. You know, what's the purpose that those relationships are serving? And, you know, for Indigenous people, for Native folks, you know, it's important in a situation where we've experienced so much marginalization, exploitation, and exclusion from, you know, the more dominant institutions of science, that we have a chance, that we're able to speak about the relationships in our knowledge system that matters to us, that it's not left up to somebody else to tell us what our knowledge means and what the value of it is, that we need to be the ones that express that. And it would be great if there hadn't been colonialism and racial capitalism and ableism and patriarchy going on for many, many generations, because then maybe we would have had the exchanges that we should have had a long time ago, and we would actually be able to speak about, you know, each other's knowledge. But we're not in that situation. That's why it's important that we're able to self-determine, have the right to speak freely about what we want to share about the relationships that matter, you know, for the knowledge systems that we value and that support our communities. So this is, for example, there is an example of such an expression produced by good folks at United Tribes Technical College some years ago, right? But for Anishinaabe people, this is kind of a snapshot of one way, one type of knowledge system. You know, for Anishinaabe people, there's actually many knowledge systems I think we would claim as part of our overall set of epistemic systems, but this is one snapshot, right? And this is an expression of our knowledge system. This is a scientific system, it's an empirical system, it's a governance system. What it shows, right, is a certain theory and philosophy of how, for Anishinaabe people, right, you know, our societies were organized very deliberately to be as adaptable as possible to the constantly changing environment around us. So both seasonally, but also across different years, to keep track of those changes. So for us, our goal, right, was to create a society that could be very responsive to the dynamics of ecosystems. And so every detail of society, its decision-making processes, its democratic processes, its ethics of personal freedom, its gender system. All of that had to be focused to make it so that society was fluid and adaptable. And there was a great emphasis on the idea that the society that was able to move and change form during different seasons to accommodate the different demands and needs that we might have during different parts of the year, was a society that really placed a premium on personal freedom and individual autonomy. But that freedom and autonomy is not just something that you have. You need a community to make it possible for you to have it. So, for us, right, our philosophies are both about just the importance of freedom and self-determination and consent, but also about having those bonds with other people, those open bonds, those strong bonds that make it possible to actually enjoy something like freedom. And so the empirical aspects of this system, across many dimensions, right, have to do with the fact that if you're trying to live according to seasons, you're trying to live according to changes in the environment, you're having to constantly take in information, share it with others, coordinate those observations, have other people review it, check a current observation with the historic record. It's a massive knowledge system that's very scientific, and it takes into consideration many, many different variables, not just ecological variables, but also political variables and jurisdictional variables. And so for Anishinaabe people, right, this type of system, historically existed across, the entire Great Lakes region, and was extremely fluid and adaptable. And people define themselves in terms of the particular responsibilities that they had within the system. If you were somebody who was particularly good with sturgeon or wild rice, you might define yourself in that way. That might be one label you had for yourself that you used to express who you were, among others, right, that were tied to other responsibilities that you had. And historically, that's how Anishinaabe people presented themselves to French and British folks, and eventually Americans. And there was a huge effort, historically, for Europeans and American settlers to try to categorize us into like stable, static nations. But instead, we were actually very fluid, and we understood how it worked, right? We understood that we were a society that was organized to reflect adaptability to a changing and dynamic ecosystem. But over time, right, as the United States became more powerful, we got forced to have to operate within the box of a nation, right? Which is why, like, my tribe is Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and we're doing our best within that, particular system. And so to get into some of the details about the empirical aspects of these relationships, right? So if you have a society, right, that's based on taking in changes and anticipating changes, then it's a society that you can really begin to understand relationships and knowledge in a cyclical, kind of constantly moving fashion. And so for us, right, we recognize that we're experiencing change around us. We're trying to anticipate change. And what's important, and some of the work I've done that's been published by Samantha Chisholm Hatfield recently, has looked at how, when Indigenous people talk about, something like change in the environment, there aren't that many Native folks that talk about, say there's a change in a plant here, or change in a fish population here. They oftentimes don't just talk about like a physical or like an animal change or a species change. They actually talk about what is happening in the broader society corresponding to that change. So if a plant changes, then that means that people might mobilize to do something else, like go fishing, or if there's a change in season, then people will have a particular ceremony or particular harvesting group, or there's a particular time when political decisions are made, or when people engage in storytelling. So when people talk about change in this way of thinking, you're always talking about the social mobilizations that are happening around you. And so it's a way of telling time. And it's a way of being attuned to what's happening in the environment, but it's not separated from the economy, from politics, from your relationships with other people. And so this type of way of thinking, this type of science, right, is one that places a huge premium on what happens when people mobilize, right? So say in a wild rice economy, at different life stages of the wild rice plant, people are sharing information with each other during ceremonies, during political meetings, during family meetings, during clan meetings, during lodge meetings, about what the habitat is like, what the plant's life cycle is like, which then determines when you might go and harvest. It might determine how much you harvest. And so it's a system in which people rely on each other, they're interdependent, and there are different kinds of knowledge and observations that are feeding into it. And so a lot of important work in Indigenous studies, or just work produced by folks that are environmental stewards within their own tribes, is trying to talk about, how it is that people are constantly sharing knowledge about what's happening out on the land, what's happening in the environment, as a way of creating interdependence, as a way of creating preparation, as a way of keeping track of change. And so ceremonies, for example, are culturally significant. They're also significant as times when people share information. The same with political meetings, the same with family meetings. All of these are activities that have multiple dimensions to them. And oftentimes when different dominant US perspectives interpret them, right, they interpret them through their lens and they only see one dimension of them, right? They see a cultural ceremony as, just something that is related to somebody's cultural fulfillment, but there's more dimensions to it than that. And so what's important, right, for Native folks, and I know some of you have been exposed to, Indigenous philosophy, or some of you know a lot about it, but it focuses a lot on the importance of having a relationship to the environment and with other people that's based on certain relational qualities like trust or reciprocity, consent, respect, inclusivity, responsibility, self-determination. And so these are highly rich qualities of what it means for a society to be able to mobilize in order to protect the environment, in order to still have a beneficial relationship with the environment, right? So take something like reciprocity. If you really believe, with a particular plant or animal, if you have a reciprocal relationship, that give and take is integral. That exchange, that gift giving back and forth is integral to your existence, and that you are responsible for protecting what you can of that species' way of life so that you can continue that reciprocity. But you also know that you can't do it alone. It takes more than one people to protect an overall habitat, right? So you've got to have reciprocity with other people. You have to have reciprocity with other cultures that share the same region. And so that's why, for example, at a certain time of year, if there's a wild rice lake that a lot of people go and harvest from, that when you start getting a sense earlier on about how much rice there's going to be, that you've got to engage in those diplomatic social activities. You have to engage in those family social activities. You have to go to those ceremonies that affirm that you're still wide awake and committed to taking care of the plant, right? And so, right, for us, it's like these relational qualities are more than just, a dogma or a faith, right? They're highly practical. They're about what it means when you don't try to hide from the fact that you're interdependent. You know where your energy comes from. You know where your nutrition comes from. You know where your meaningfulness comes from in terms of your own mental health. You know directly where those things come from, and you can't do it alone. And so these relational qualities, right, are part of the larger empirical system, which again, right, for, a lot of us, who have been in, kind of dominant science institutions like, universities, we wonder why oftentimes those jobs can be so awful, like and why some of the colleagues can be so hard to work with, and why it just feels like really, really challenging to try to create positivity in some of those environments, some of those institutions, because we're like, what kind of knowledge system would let things get that way, right? A knowledge system has to be a support network just as much as it has to be a place where we can learn empirical insights and collect information. And so in this way, right, we think that when you exercise those social activities each year, you strengthen that trust, that consent, or that responsibility, those relational qualities, and that helps you be more cohesive as a society, as a knowledge system. It helps you innovate, right? It helps create the grounds for people to be creative. It helps you be prepared. It helps you to have a knowledge base to be able to be ready for those changes that happen. And so this is kind of one way of, of thinking about it. And what I wanted to point folks to is, the idea that, this way of thinking about, knowledge systems and their relationship to social activities, and to thinking about all the relationships that go into knowledge systems, right? Thinking about a knowledge system as all of its relationships, and not just prioritizing, a couple of them, or not, denying, as I know a couple people sort of deny that the knowledge system that they're in has anything to do with relationships, right? They think it's just about, researchers and subjects, but no, it's about relationships. And, it's important that we acknowledge the different aspects of the relationships that are in our knowledge systems. So, in the literature, Native folks, and we oftentimes don't get the credit we deserve for being out there and publishing things that we're doing. And I like to say that for a lot of Native scholars, as well as a number of non-Native scholars that work with tribes, we're putting information out there about work that reflects this way of thinking. So for example, this first citation talks about work from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which is an intertribal, scientific, cross-boundary organization, the Great Lakes region, that is its board are federally recognized tribes, and the commission's responsible for taking care of the landscape and the lands that those tribes ceded by treaty. It's called the ceded territories. And so this article, for example, talks about how this organization sees itself as carrying out those responsibilities, those relational qualities, and has developed its own inventories for birch bark, and understanding for birch trees, and understanding how they're affected by climate change, and how that's tied to tribal economies and tribal arts and tribal culture, in addition to how it relates to that of other people that share the Great Lakes region. And so you get articles like this that kind of talk in different ways about how Indigenous people have been leading efforts to create the type of coordination that I mentioned in the previous slide. Or for example, from a Great Lakes case, but not Anishinaabe, for Menominee people, where I mentioned I've had a long time working relationship. The College of Menominee Nation created in 1994 a Sustainable Development Institute, a research institute on sustainable development. That was like decades before my own university decided to rename its natural resource school, a school of sustainability. And again, this idea, right, that and if you check out the article, you'll see it was an Indigenous-led, interdisciplinary, interscience effort to create a way of understanding sustainability, an agenda for sustainability that would support Menominee people, support Menominee nationhood. And as some of you know, Menominee is well known for its forestry operation, which it's had for a long time. Thinking beyond the Great Lakes region, and into the kind of bordering areas, whether it's the St. Lawrence or even further away, right, to the Pacific Northwest, there's all sorts of examples of Native folks doing this type of work and writing about it, but unique to their own cultures, their own situations, right? I mean, this multi-authored article led by Arquette and Environmental Health Perspectives, talks about issues of environmental justice and pollution to fish, where there's a group of scientists from, I think, universities and maybe the federal government who were just looking at the pollution relationship in terms of bear exposure. But knowledge holders there, community holders there, scientists that the Akwesasne tribe had employed themselves, pointed out that actually risk goes way beyond that, right? Risk has way more variables. If you can't eat a particular fish because of pollution, well, what are you eating instead? Or if that's a food that's part of your culture, well, what does that mean for your mental health, for your social health? And so they were looking at way more variables, and had to push back and say that actually a scientific assessment needs to look at more than just a couple of variables. It needs to be much more complex, because risks is not just about an individual exposure, it's about the fabric of their societies. Or even issues like, say, scientific peer review. I know for a lot of my articles that get sent off to a journal, and I've served on many journals. And you get the blind review process, whether it's double or triple. But for a lot of Indigenous folks, right, we have long traditions of peer review as well, and they're not called peer review, and they don't necessarily look like a blind review process, but they're quite detailed, actually. I mean, if you're known to be a knowledge holder, and this Trosper article from Conservation Ecology talks about this, that historically for certain folks in the Pacific Northwest, if you were known to be a knowledge holder for like salmon or something like that, you were accountable to multiple layers of peer review in the community, multiple layers in which different folks that were you were accountable to got a chance to hear from what you were doing in terms of the management of salmon habitat, and that there were multiple feedback loops, there were multiple checks and balances to make sure that people were carrying out their responsibilities, and there were a number of resilient strategies for ensuring that different societies within the region would be able to help each other out in times of shortage. And so there was a communications set up, there were diplomatic relations set up as part of the knowledge system, and so there's this literature out there, right, that again is just talking about the collective agency and the scientific efforts that Native people are doing as a way of really enacting a relational conception of what a knowledge system is, and not just limiting themselves to certain variables, but being very expansive of what they're looking at, right? This work by the Swinomish tribe, for example, on climate change and health was sort of looking at the idea that oftentimes, certain dominant scientists would identify certain types of health variables or health indicators, but for Swinomish people, that didn't make any sense to them. And so these articles describe a whole research process of how Swinomish people determined how they were going to define their own health, and the research methods that would be tied to what it would mean to assess their health, what it would mean to understand the health risks that they were facing with respect to climate change. And the health indicators they chose, you can see in these articles, have to do with things like culture and mental health, and the physical activity, and the particular species that mattered to them, not just as sources of nutrition, but for the overall fabric of their society. And that second article here, it talks about how, as part of this work, they developed a curriculum for students that was tied to their own kind of 13 moons seasonal model, different from the one I showed you, but very much in dialogue, right? And then you have important literatures that, again, oftentimes led by non-native folks. These are from Alaska, where it demonstrates that oftentimes certain dominant scientific institutions would look at certain things like hunting regulations or the climate change risks, and just look at them in terms of like measurements from a weather station, statistical changes. And so in articles like this, it shows how Indigenous hunters and harvesters in the Arctic region, they would be talking about how climate change was seriously affecting them and was totally not matched up with the policies for like how much you can hunt in a subsistence system, or how much you can harvest. And so they had to have a conversation with the scientists, and oftentimes their observations were dismissed because they couldn't demonstrate them statistically. But then it turned out that these harvesters were actually not just looking at a couple of samples or indicators of environmental change, but were balancing like 20, 30, 40 different variables, including political ones and cultural ones, multiple different observations of the environment. It turned out, according to both of these studies, that the harvesters were right, and that they were experiencing extreme forms of change, even though from a certain scientific perspective, the changes didn't look so so extreme. And I think the moral of these stories, though, is not that one science is right and one is wrong, but how come the relationships weren't initially there for people to collaborate in a positive way? And so part of the success of work like this is to demonstrate a model, right, of actually that people should already be lined up. They should already be coordinated. They should have great respect for the knowledge systems that they participate in. There's no reason to immediately be skeptical about somebody else's knowledge, especially if you're thinking about a knowledge system that may have been persisting in a region for many centuries. It's good to be open and to be able to try to be coordinated, right? Because going back to that model I showed you that kind of I created, right? What's the point of a knowledge system if we're not all able to share, if we're not all coordinated, if we don't all have those relationships that can help us all get ready, all mobilize, and all respond. We have all this other great literature too, talking about, the first one is from the Umatilla tribe and the second from Akwesasne, about our Native folks have taken leadership in regional science management. Both of these articles talk about how, Indigenous concepts tied to important foods or important cultural philosophies of regional collaboration, how they are able to shape, the overall agendas for science in a particular region. And so I think it's important, right, that, in a context where you've got states and tribes and the federal government and counties and cities, that, Indigenous knowledge systems are very much, in the position to be in leadership in terms of defining, what those priorities are. So the first article having to do with Umatilla that's, lead authored by Quamps in Ecology and Society talks about how first foods for the Umatilla, particularly culturally relevant foods, were actually part of what of an overall agenda to organize science around responding and preparing for climate change. And one of the things that actually they found out, which I think is an important point, is that when they organized their system around first foods and they thought about their own food system and how their ancestors did things, one of the things that they actually noticed that was out of line was that their current environmental management regime didn't have a good gender balance. It was mostly dominated by men. And so actually one of the things that came out of this initiative was the creation or the attempt to create, again, gender balance and to validate women's ways of knowing and the work that they were doing that was going uncredited and unnoticed. So, again, right, I think for us, and this is a slide I'll just close with, for us, when you're thinking about a knowledge system like relationships, you're wanting to really try to take in all the relationships that matter to that knowledge system and not trying to isolate, empirical inquiry or some pure space of empirical inquiry from all the other factors that provide funding for it, that determine who's privileged and who's not, that set norms of inclusion and inclusion that affect people's mental health. And so last slide I just wanted to show, right, is, I think when we think about, different knowledge systems, especially in the United States, where we really find that there's a fairly dominant set of knowledge institutions like the one that I work in. And then for tribes, right, we're trying to do our best to rebuild, to reestablish, to awaken our own educational systems, our own scientific systems. But for us, right, if you think about the span of historic time, like when I was studying, if the blue is like a couple hundred years, and being somebody that works in climate change, people would say, when did the field of climate change start? And then it would be like, the early part of the climate change science was like the 19th century, when some of the original discoveries tied to the greenhouse effect and other things occurred. And so it started then. And that's supposed to be a historical perspective, right? And it's a way of privileging, right, the period of time that the United States has been established. And then when we think about science before that, before the Industrial Revolution, there's certainly some bright examples going way, way back. But really the emphasis of the scientific period and the knowledge period is kind of the last couple of centuries, the last 2 or 3 centuries. And certainly this has been my experience. And then the idea is, well, how does that does that, continue, right? How does science as it's most understood in a dominant way right now, how does that move forward? But for us, right, our several thousand-year history is what's in front of us. That's what we're thinking of. And actually the period where, and this period of time, right, has all of these seasonal, changes. It's a time of change. And we know that historically there were big disruptions in our society, upheavals, transformations. So it's not a stagnant history. And, the seasons, the environment was constantly changing, but that's what's in front of us, is that big history. And so these are our periods of time. And the period of time in which the more dominant science institutions, like, my university was founded in 1817. I mean, that's just a small part of our history, small part of our history. And so when we think about, moving forward, because this part of our history has been so damaging, we've experienced, boarding schools and land dispossession and violence of all different kinds, right, against some of the most vulnerable members of our communities. We've experienced political disrespect, the suppression of our sovereignty. It's not a period of time that we're wanting to perpetuate, right? And so, we're looking for our own knowledge systems to awaken and to restore, so that we can have that trustworthy knowledge, so that we can be confident in the information that comes in our society, and that we can feel fulfilled culturally and socially by our participation in those knowledge systems. And I put some other different color arrows too, because we feel the same way I think about other communities, right? People of color in the United States, right? Who have also knowledge systems and histories and connections to the land and the environment that are also suppressed. And we want everybody, right? We want liberation, and we want, there to be knowledge systems that reflect other people's values and norms and things that are going to make them, successful and support their aspirations. And so, we don't want to continue this period where we've just had to fight and struggle for small representation in some of the dominant scientific institutions. We want a time in which we're free to be able to have knowledge systems that really produce knowledge that's important for us and for our lives. And so, this is kind of the big picture, at least for a lot of the folks that I work with, and the way we kind of understand the history. And so folks that kind of talk about the more dominant scientific institutions as the history of science, it just doesn't strike us as accurate, because we've been around for so much longer and have scientific traditions that precede that in the way that I described earlier. So, hey, good to have a chance to share with you. I look forward to having further conversation in our exchange period.
Yeah.
Kyle, thank you so much. That was extraordinary.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that maybe if Sherri and Darren, if you want to just weigh in a little bit first, and then we'll get to some of the questions that we're receiving.
It's hard to add in because Kyle has presented probably at least 2 semesters worth of work into a 40-minute talk. The history of ideas that he articulates quite seamlessly are dictating and reflect the work of many, many people on the ground. I think one of the extraordinary things about Kyle's work is, and maybe this might be one of the questions I have for him, is just this connection and background. He comes from philosophy, and yet I know most anthropologists, my PhD is in anthropology, who don't spend even the same amount of time as Kyle does, sort of in the landscape, on the land with Indigenous people, actively engaging on the ground. So it's I always find that interesting in terms of, as a philosopher, he gets his hands dirty quite a bit. So I just say that I don't have much to add. I think there's a lot of questions, and I'm looking forward to discussion. I don't know if you had anything, Sherri.
Yeah, I just have been thinking as you've been talking, Kyle, in the very first talk that Darren and I did prior to this series, what kind of led to this series. one of the things that I talked about, I think it's the very first question or one of the first questions that we had posted in the chat. I don't know if the person transferred it over to the Q&A, but looking at different ways of knowing and different ways of being in relationship with our surroundings, and how the scientific lens is very narrow, only looking at a way of knowing that's associated with a population of white men from Europe, essentially, is the whole foundational basis for all scientific knowing, and that's that limits the capacity of science to truly do its job. And so when you're talking about these knowledge systems, I just did a talk the other day. I prepared a talk that I recorded for the National Tribal Forum on Air Quality, and they wanted to talk about sovereignty. And so, when I think about sovereignty, we can certainly think about the sovereignty that comes out of the East Asian theology that was adopted by Europeans to mean ultimate power, and ultimate power that was conditional on the goodwill of a sovereign who was unpredictable. Or we can think about it from our Indigenous perspective. And when I think about it from my Indigenous perspective, I think about Endabello Molsom Deeben, which means I own myself, and recognizing that Niguskikdamik, as Mother Earth, also owns herself, and that there's sovereignty in all of that, and that there's interdependence in our interrelatedness as well, and all of these rights wrapped up in what we know. And so when we're thinking about knowledge systems and relational aspect of it, all of my sensors were lighting up when I was hearing you describe the ways that you frame your knowledge systems for your students. So I just want to thank you for what you shared with us, and I, like Darren, want to get into the questions because we have some really great questions in the Q&A. So Laura, if you want to provide some of those questions to Kyle.
Sure. So I'll start, but Sherri and Darren, please feel free if you feel like there's something in here that you really want to make sure that we get addressed. So I think maybe just start with one here that I'm seeing around looking at the different knowledge systems that you've been speaking about, and a comment about how the scientific knowledge system, the Western scientific knowledge system, oftentimes seems like it's trying to control or debunk or displace or eliminate Indigenous knowledge systems, and that this competitive environment has dominated, and just wondering, I guess the question is more about how can we imagine building a bridge between the two? What must be the dominant scientific system be willing to let go of, or give up to enable the working of more systems? So maybe we can start there and then get to some of the rest.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of angles to that question that I'll speak to, and yeah, appreciate the time in asking the question. So the first thing, right, is I think at a kind of just and many people have experienced this, not just Native people, but other people of color or gender non-binary people, women have experienced this, but the dismissiveness of certain, like certain scientists will hear that a piece of knowledge, and their presumption is to to dismiss it out of hand. And Sherri spoke to some of those experiences just now. And so at first, like, well, why would anyone do that? Like, you don't know anything about somebody else's knowledge system, but you definitely know at that moment that you're going to dismiss it, right? And it's just really not only is that kind of attitude just not one that's conducive to a just equitable and supportive society, including just a society that's a fun place to live in, but it's also funny about just historically, because we know that so much of what kind of passes as dominant science right now came from the theft of information from different cultures, including Indigenous ones. And even there's a study by I can put it in the chat because I'm blanking on the name of the historian, that talks about how in the 1700s in the kind of Atlantic region there was, with Europeans a climate change crisis. They thought there was going to be a huge cooling. They were looking for plants that were adapted to the cooler North American environment that they could grow in England when the cooling really happened. And wild rice was one of them. And so kind of all of these informed Europeans thought that wild rice grew spontaneously, and so maybe it would grow spontaneously in England, when the great cooling was about to occur. And so there's all this history, right, of earlier versions of, kind of empirical and scientific reasoning on big crises that where again there was a kind of a falling back or relying on native knowledge, but not crediting native people at all, just and so I think those I think it's important to put that kind of overall aspect in context of how certain scientific attitudes appear to many of us, right? When we experience them. But then in terms of like, well, what can dominant science institutions do? So I think for different Native folks, our goal is our own communities and peoples, and so we're going to do what it takes to fulfill our responsibilities and to strengthen our communities. And we know that the larger dominant society out there, that they could change or they could not change. We're ready for anything. We've been ready, because we've experienced, everything in the past, our ancestors did. And so we're not going to wait for dominant institutions to change. We're going to push them to change. We're going to tell them they have to change. We're going to say they must change, but we're not going to count on it because the changes are extreme, right? I mean, the fact that on a scientific project, if you have a scientist who's like a principal investigator and they're working with traditional knowledge holders, it's still quite normal that it would be actually considered generous if those traditional knowledge holders got like, I don't know, $5,000 for their efforts. That would be considered generous. Whereas the PI on the scientists probably gets more than that each year in summer salary. They get the longevity of whatever tenure or promotion is associated with their publications, which would total in the millions of dollars, not to mention their health benefits and other things, right? So they get a windfall. And then they also get the congratulatory confidence of believing that $5,000, and again, that's high, usually it's much less, was really generous to those traditional knowledge holders. And I'm not going to speak to the economic or social situation of many of our knowledge keepers, but in an institution where things like that are actually not only considered normal, but are considered generous, we're a long way of from changing. And so I think we have to look in a very sobering way at our institutions. We need to keep pushing them to have more of a social impact, but we really need to tell them that they need to interrogate what stories they're telling about their efforts. Are they telling the story that they're helping other folks, right? Which again, for Native people is a little bit weird because, like, for example, the University of Michigan was established, and you can read the Treaty of Fort Meigs, I think it's Article 16. It was established on an endowment from Potawatomi, Odawa, and Chippewa people, Anishinaabe people, right? They were land that they could buy or sell for the establishment of the College of Detroit. It was endowed by Anishinaabe people, and for campuses that pride themselves with how the endowment supports their research agenda, it's important to note, right, those connections of, well, who's dependent on who's dependent on who. And I think people need to tell a different story, right? The story of of actually what it means to participate in the narrative of Native people empowering our own institutions. And so, I think institutions and the work they do with tribes, with other groups, need to show that there is a actual institution building, long-term institution building within the societies that they choose to work and collaborate with. And if you can't show that, right, if you can't show that, then the right change hasn't occurred yet. But anyways, there's a lot more to say about that. Those are some quick takes.
Kyle, if I could just step in, Laura, there are a number of great questions about the relationship between Indigenous knowledge systems and kind of what we refer to as Western knowledge systems. Are they at odds? How do we create a bridge between them? How do we make different kinds of data qualitative and quantitative, fit together, or have sort of legitimacy in communicating across these different knowledge traditions. And I've heard you talk about that, Kyle, and that just, you could take a slightly deeper dive. I know there was a section where you talked about it, but there's still this sort of like, what is this, how do we kind of reckon with them? And, are they commensurable? Are they, this kind of thing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm also, I see in some of the questions in the chat that I'll kind of try to put into that. So there's a couple of things as somebody that, facilitates a lot of, knowledge exchange, and really, I work very hard, to connect people, to get people in a situation where they can work productively with each other. And so there's definitely things that I've picked up, along the way. And so, a couple things, right, is that what I think is really interesting is that even after all that Native folks have been through, especially with regard to dominant science institutions. I mean, some scientists did, experiments on like Native children in residential schools. I mean, where like uranium mining and the lack of disclosure of the health impact. I mean, this is not this is some of the most well documented history. And if you've done an ethics training for your research institution, sometimes these are the cases that are used. And so, despite all that, right, Native people continue to be some of the biggest advocates of science, right, and supporters of science that are very frustrated by skepticism against science that has detrimental impacts, right, on our health. And I think it's important, right, I've talking to elders, other members of the communities, right, if they hear about like some type of science done like at the University of Michigan, they don't just dismiss it. They're kind of like, well, interesting, that, so I see, so they use this instrument and that took in a sample this way, and well, that's interesting, and yeah, that's a great perspective on that. If you do it that way, you get that perspective and that information. Wonderful, as long as it's an ethical process, as long as it doesn't depend on creating machines and instruments using supplies that are mined from people's homelands and equity, right? I mean, why not? If that's how you study it, that's the information you're going to get. And how can we work together and collaborate, right? So one of the reasons I mentioned this is because something like statistics or numbers, I mean, Native people, Indigenous people can absolutely use those and make those work. There's a book edited by Chris Anderson and another co-author on Indigenous statistics. So, there's no reason why we can't use those things in ways that are, supportive of our values and our innovation and, our ways of thinking about knowledge. Now, historically, that's not been in the case, right? Historically, abstract thought, universal thought, global thought, has been, associated, like in the United States context with, discoveries made or tools made or papers published, largely by white guys. And what's interesting about that, and, Sherri brought this up earlier, is that, anybody, I don't care what culture you're from, anybody can have a universal perspective or a global perspective. I mean, you ask anybody, well, tell me how the globe works, or, you give me a theory of how all humanity operates. Now for Native folks, I mean, there might not be a lot of excitement about, about doing it, but if you ask somebody to do it, they're going to have that perspective. And so the problem that we face is that what passes for universal or abstract or global analysis is actually a very local perspective. And I think this was one of the points that Sherri was making, right? Is that, any local culture, any provincial culture, right? Just culture, right, is going to have its views on what's immediately around it, and you can project it and abstract beyond. But the problem is there's been a value system that's been created, which is a certain type of universal, global, abstract thinking has sort of passed for the only type. And so we're actually in a situation where very local cultural formation that you can trace to different parts of, the United States and Europe and other places has found a way to make itself pass as like the only way to do it, right? And then people have ignored the fact that, right, prior to the intensive colonization of the United States, that Native people were regional societies. We had local aspects, families, be huge trade networks, huge diplomatic networks. And so that distinction of local and global is a highly problematic one, and usually made to kind of box us in to this kind of local kind of reservation way of thinking, which again was not a way that we used to live and that our societies were originally designed. So I think those are important points to make. Now, just lastly, when I say that any knowledge system can be described in terms of relationships, I don't think that means that that we're in the position to make like an absolute statement about whether sustainability science as it's practiced as the University of Michigan is exactly different or exactly the same as Anishinaabe knowledge, right? I think we need to move beyond that. And I've published a little bit about this, but we have to realize that these words that we're using to communicate in English or Spanish or whatever the dominant language is, I mean, these are just provisional terms. We're just trying to relate to each other, and none of these terms are going to do justice. So is it true that we should call Indigenous knowledge Indigenous science? Yeah, that is true. It's science. But there are a lot of circumstances where I don't want to associate it with science, right? It depends on, right? So I think it's important, right? It's not going to be one or the other. It's about the actual situation that you're in. What are the communicative issues in the exact situation you're in, and how do you create collegiality? How do you create coordination? How do you create friendship and a working relationship? That has a lot to do with your language, but it's important not to think that any of us have gotten it right at one point, because again, it depends on the situation, and sensitivity to the particular collaborative situation that you're in is much more important than whether we figured out the right word for something.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a really good segue to our next session. That's what we're going to be talking about with Linda Smith in session 3. I think that when we're talking about this, it's really important to recognize that it takes an extraordinary lack of awareness to not recognize inherent bias and confirmation bias within a system of knowledge. And, being aware of that, having discussions around that, I think is critically important to the progression of those relationships and the building of those relationships. I just wanted to come back around to your transition from philosophy to real, heavy research oriented position, and ask you to just talk momentarily, bring us out, talking a little bit about, because we do only have a short amount of time left, the importance of bringing environmental justice into the conversation surrounding research and then application of scientific knowledge as it pertains to things like Line 3 going through the wild ricing lakes in Minnesota. That environmental justice component can't be separated out and viewed as a different discipline when you're talking about the engagement of research, but also the application of that research as applied in the work that goes forward. Can you just talk about the importance of that correlation?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you, Sherri. So, the one kind of conceptual constellation that's out there, kind of separates out, science and justice, to the point where, oftentimes, right, a lot of folks talk about how, medical experiments done under wartime or under other highly problematic circumstances, create all this important, medical knowledge. And, I think for a lot of Anishinaabe people, I think people would acknowledge that, engineering different engineering things were derived from different things that happened, but they wouldn't call that knowledge, right? I mean, how could that be knowledge if it was created from the cradle of inequity and violence, right? And so I think from a Native conceptual standpoint, again, each culture is different, but I've had a lot of conversations with different Native folks that have had their own takes and perspectives, on this, right? But knowledge has to be just and equitable. In fact, part of what it means to be empirically rigorous, it is to be equitable. If you're creating knowledge, if you're doing experiments, and the people who are going to be affected by it are not part of the design of that work, then what are you doing, right? I mean, the idea of like knowledge for knowledge's sake is a bit peculiar, because like, what are you doing the knowledge for? And so there's actually not really a separation that just to think of what knowledge means, you have to think about the total collective of people that participate in it, that benefit from it. And so in the work that I do on environmental justice, we've really seen the consequences of a knowledge system that hasn't really been cultivated in that way. A knowledge system that a lot of Anishinaabe people wouldn't call a knowledge system. So like with line 3 or line 5, in the Great Lakes region, one of the shocking things is there haven't actually been a lot of research that was already done that was connected to the habitats and environments that matter to Anishinaabe people who are affected by that, right? It just hasn't been a focus by a lot of research institutions. And so then the companies that are applying like Enbridge, they oftentimes will appeal to their own experts as part of those reports that then produce studies that nobody really even has time to respond to. And then there aren't actually the resources available to support, tribes' own inquiries into issues of safety and environmental integrity in those areas. But the other part of that, right, is that that's just operating at the level of policy science in terms of knowledge of particular areas that are affected by those pipelines. Anishinaabe people have a lot of knowledge about that, a lot of information about what safe enough means, what risk means, what it means for an environment to be affected. I've had many conversations with folks that have told me, non-native folks, they've said, well, it'd be a lot easier, if one of those pipelines went through, like a national park or something like that, or like the rarest of habitats. But see, that's already a non-native way, right? Who's to say that for like line 5 in the Mackinac Straits area, that's a sacred area tied to like origin stories and multiple cultural and social activities. Just because it doesn't meet a certain standard of rarity or exclusivity from, the Michigan dominant society, that has nothing to do with the significance for Anishinaabe people, right? And so Anishinaabe knowledge speaks to the significance of that area. It speaks to the plant and animal communities and the activities associated with them in that area. It speaks to its history. And so in that way, you can't separate out environmental justice from these questions of knowledge systems at a lot of different levels. The dominant society both has not prioritized research areas that matter to Indigenous people, which is why some of those articles I pointed out to you all are really important, because they're examples of what things look like when tribes do play that leadership role. But then our own knowledge, right, which should be weighted at the same level as other types of scientific research. You can't have a situation where it's okay for a company applying for a permit to marshal its own experts, yet it's some huge struggle for Indigenous experts to weigh in effectively in a consultative process or in a public process about the danger and the risks. And so anyways, that's a quick take on your really good question, Sherri.
Yeah, I was going to just say maybe Darren and Sherri, if you want to just give us a couple of closing thoughts as well, and then I have some logistics as well.
Sure, let me go. I just want to thank Kyle and everyone participating. I'm sorry we didn't get to your questions, all of them today. we're going to keep the conversation going. And I think we were strategic in which ones we answered. Some of the questions, especially related to kind of the best practices around building trust. And, I saw a lot of these sort of like, how do we come together types of questions will be definitely the theme for the next session. So keep that critical inquiry going. It is really important. And, Kyle and I have had these discussions in the past, like we've been doing this work with, Indigenous people responding to the emerald ash borer here in Maine and across our region. But and we've had very productive scientific exchanges. And I'll just say, as both an advertisement and a reflection of things that I've been thinking about and reflected on with Kyle in the past many years, is that there's something about when you bring Indigenous knowledge holders and Western scientists and researchers, and you bring them out into the place where they have knowledge exchanges with the resource being right there. I find that to create, and that's just like a baseline of like, well, why would you do that and not be in the lab or some seminar room? There's just nothing like people knowing things from different angles, coming together and describing it and engaging with it in that place is such a powerful, and I've had many Western scientists just thank me for even getting them out into the environment with other kinds of knowledge keepers, just saying like, it really changed my perspective. So I think some of that is about enacting and doing and being there. So that's my attempt at sort of making a connection and wrapping up, because I think there's just that the power of that in terms of collaboration and building trust, given all the difficulties we've gone over today in terms of these histories, is a really powerful thing. And I just want to stick that pin and also thank Kyle. I'll hand it over to Sherri.
Yeah, Kyle, I also want to thank you. We could continue talking to you for months and still there would be more to share. And so thank you for giving us this time today and for sharing some of your important work and your insights with us. And I hope this is only the beginning of a relationship, that we're forming. And so, I think it's important for us to really begin to think about the fact that the systems that we're operating under have been based on principles of exclusion rather than inclusion. And right now, what we're doing is we're working toward greater inclusion. This series is part of that attempt toward greater inclusion of really looking at the value and the importance of Indigenous knowledge in relation to having millennia, oftentimes, worth of data in place on a specific plot of land connected to a specific waterway, being very, very deeply interrelationship with ecosystems. And so having something very important to offer, but also looking at the ways that environmental impact studies and other such studies have been utilized to diminish Indigenous rights and to allow for activity that is creating a purposeful disruption of cultural continuity, and that there is an ethical obligation of those who are engaged in that work to be considering the continuation of the cultural well-being of Indigenous peoples who are originals to a place. And that's not considered, and that needs to be considered. So as we move forward, we're going to talk more next time about how we build those relationships, and then in the final session about how do we bring this all together and where do we go from here, moving toward potentially another series in the fall. And so thank you to Darren, to Kyle, and to Laura, and to all of those who are joining us today for being a part of this really important series and traveling on this journey with us. So, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to reiterate, Kyle, thank you so much for everything that you shared. I'm so glad that, we have a recording that we can share, because like Darren said, it's a lot to digest, and I definitely know that I want to go and watch it again. So that will be coming out by next week. We'll have an email to you all with the recording and some of the resources that were mentioned, so that you can look into some of the further learning suggestions. we saw there was a hand up and so many questions that, we couldn't get to all of it. But like Sherri just referenced, we're really starting to think about what else we would do beyond just this series, because there are such great people in this community working on all kinds of things and really interested. And so please do fill out the reflection form. I don't know, Katie, if you want to put that in the chat, but just, and we'll send out a message again with that, just because it's really, we don't have the time to hear you all right now, but we definitely, want to hear from all of you so that we can figure out what else we want to create together. And so I think otherwise we'll see you again on June 2nd, but thank you again to everybody for participating and to the GCSE team behind the scenes. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Upchich.
Upchich.